At 7:42 a.m. on April 12, 1940, Staff Sergeant Raymond Collins crouched in the shadow of a makeshift projection booth at Camp Forest, Tennessee, watching a crowd of German prisoners gather on a muddy parade ground. Raymond Collins, 28, tired, from Dayton, Ohio, held a spool of 35mm film in his gloved hands. The air smelled of diesel and damp canvas. A distant train clanked. Men shifted boots. A soft murmur rose. Across the yard, a captured Feldwebel watched with one eyebrow raised. He did not speak English. He did not need to. The opening frames of an American musical clicked into light. The projector hummed. A piano started. A trumpet cut in. Jazz in the open air. This was against orders. This was against Army regs. It was also the only thing standing between a camp on the brink and the next violent escape attempt. No one expected the reaction. The Germans looked stunned. They leaned forward, as if someone had staged a scene from another world. They whispered that the whole thing must be a show, staged, fake, a trick to soften them up. Ray turned the spool. He did not believe them. He believed in the music. He believed in what it could do. And he knew one thing. If this failed, men would die. If it worked, it might save dozens. That question stayed with him as the trumpet cut to a major chord. Raymond Ray Collins was 28 years old. He was from a row house on the east side of Dayton. His father fixed bicycles. His mother kept the books at the bakery. Ray learned to fix radios before he learned to drive. He liked simple things, clean threads, and even weld, a song on the radio while he worked. Before the war, he ran the projection equipment at the Strand Theater on 3rd Street. He loaded reels at midnight. He knew film stock like a friend. He knew how to coax light out of a broken lamp. He could fix a leaking chassis and a temperamental spool with equal hand-s. DSE enlisted as a supply sergeant. Ray shipped across the Atlantic in late 1943. He had been in the Army for 2 years by April 1945. He had worked supply lines, unloaded trucks, and kept engines running. He had a quiet manner and calloused thumbs. He arrived at Camp Forest 9 weeks earlier. The camp held mostly German prisoners captured in Italy and in the Ardennes. The command assigned him to the motor pool and to the laundry detail. Officially, his job was to keep the camp running. Unofficially, he was the man every GI asked when a projector broke. The camp had problems. Food shortages had passed, but tension remained. Rumors and whispers moved faster than policy memos. Fights in the yard were becoming more frequent. Men tried to tunnel. 2 weeks earlier, a prisoner tried to climb the fence and was shot during the attempt. The mood had turned fragile. Ray watched that mood like a mechanic studies a failing engine. Small noises told him things. The way men sat, the way they avoided eye contact, the way songs turned sour. He had seen it before. Men with nothing to hold on to tended to break in unpredictable ways. He kept thinking of the Strand. He kept thinking of the sound of a piano in a dark room. He kept thinking that what the camp lacked most was not stricter orders, but something to hold people's attention, something to remind them of a human world beyond the fence. The problem was simple and brutal. Despair killed as surely as bullets. It showed up as fistfights. It showed up as a frantic climb over razor wire. It showed up in quiet that lasted too long. The first name Ray could not shake was Klaus Müller. He was 22 from Hamburg, a factory apprentice before the war. Klaus had been captured in late 1944 and sent stateside in January. He had a quick laugh that Ray remembered. He also had a scar along his jaw from a childhood fall. On February 25, 1945, at 03:10 hours, Klaus attempted to crawl under the fence. He tangled in the wire. A sentry fired. Klaus died before the medics carried him away. They registered him as a suspicious escapee. Ray registered him first as a human being who had been losing sleep and hope. The image of Klaus's scarred jaw haunted him. The second casualty was Johann Becker, age 29, from Mannheim. Johann had been a teacher. He refused to speak at roll call. He refused to eat the canned meat. On March 1, 1945, Johann walked straight into the river that ran by the camp. He left behind a note in German that the camp interpreters later described. "I could not live in a world that keeps breaking." He drowned. The coroner recorded the time of death as 0420 hours. Ray found the boots he had left on the bank. Both deaths carried the same message: a system of custody without channel. S of meaning leads to thin, sharp endings. The men were labeled escapees, suicides, operational losses. On paper they were names and numbers. On the ground, Ray saw faces and rooms, and the way music stopped when someone left. He could list more. Otto Kraus, 21, lung collapse after sleeping outside. Dieter Lang, 24, fever and neglect over 3 days. Their files sat behind stacks of gray forms, stamped and neat. Ray did not trust forms. He trusted the dark rooms where men sat and stared. The camp command answered with memos. Increased patrols, they said. Strict enforcement of camp regulations. They refused to approve any entertainment that might soften interrogation or be mistaken for propaganda. They feared rumors. They feared concessions. They feared losing control. But the body count kept rising. That was intolerable to Ray. He kept thinking of the strand and the projector lamp's orange glow. He kept thinking that an hour of music might be the difference between another name on a ledger and a man going home alive after the war. So he began to imagine a different problem, not just how to stop escapes, but how to offer a shape of meaning in the day. He thought of creating a cinema inside the camp. He thought of bringing a jazz band in plain sight. It seemed small. It seemed impossible. It would also break rules. But the alternative, he felt, would break men. The technical problem was not a broken projector. It was policy. Army regs were a machine of paper and clauses. Ray had a projection license, a storage locker, and 2 working lamps. What he lacked was authorization. Officially, prisoners were to be kept in orderly custody until processing and repatriation. Recreation programs existed in theaterless form: chess, limited reading, a YMCA pamphlet. But anything that looked like entertainment for the prisoners had to be routed through the provost marshal, the adjutant, and the office of the judge advocate. Each office added a delay. Each delay created resistance. The memos used language that sounded cautious but meant closure. Risk of propaganda, they wrote. Security hazard. Unauthorized gatherings. That fraction of bureaucratic delay meant men continued to sleep in tents, to watch the same square of sky, to calculate ways out. That fraction of a second delay in war often meant death. On a human scale, it meant every slow suicide and escape attempt. Ray explained what he wanted to the regimental clerk. He tried the chaplain. He even tried the provost lieutenant who loved silent movies. Each meeting felt like turning a rusted valve. Within specifications, they said. We will not authorize additional recreational items at this time. The word specifications became a drumbeat in Ray's ears. The engineering officers raised safety concerns. Film stock was flammable. Electricity in the theater area was precarious. Instruments might be used to conceal contraband. The legal office warned about liability. The intelligence officers feared that a packed audience could be a cover for coded messages. The barbed wire around the camp was not just metal, it was anxiety. Those who could authorize a program had reasons to refuse. Higher command had circular priorities: security first, rehabilitation secondary. There was no moral calculus that weighed daily despair against abstract security language. The memos leaned on the side of caution, and caution in a system under stress became cruelty. Ray watched memos stack. He watched men die. He thought of the strand. He thought of the projector lamp and the way a dark room could hold people's attention. He also thought of a detail the memos overlooked: the human cost of boredom and enforced idleness. The Army had armies of regulations written by middle managers far from the muddy parade ground. The regulations were not malicious. They were inattentive. So the technical fix had to be twofold. First, he needed a safe projection rig that minimized the camp's stated safety concerns. Second, he needed plausible deniability, a way to show the command that the program was a working detail, not propaganda. He needed allies. He needed proof. Proof, however, required a test. A test required a screening. A screening required a place. A place required turning an old supply shed into a theater. That was the scissors edge. To create a theater without permission meant he would be punishable. It also meant he might save lives. Ray weighed the options like a man balancing a generator on a wet roof. If they found out, he was liable for court-martial. If they didn't, and the program worked, he could keep saving men. Those were not easy choices. They were choices like tightening a bolt on a plane mid-flight. The third death happened on March 14, 1945. His name was Friedrich Fritz Hanke. Fritz was 25, from Dresden. He had been a baker before the war. He was a big man who made small jokes. On the night of March 13th, guards reported a scuffle near the mess tent. Radio logs later showed a string of terse communications. 2 men missing from tent, reported Guard Corporal Leeds at 0218. Check perimeter, replied Sergeant Hall at 0220. Fence breach suspected, Hall added at 0227. A chase followed. Fritz and another man cut through a drainage ditch. That was when the engine of a truck struck the man. He was struck by a vehicle sent to sweep the perimeter, or so the after-action report said. The camp recorded the incident as an accidental death during an escape attempt. The wingman, Eric Lang, age 23, survived and was returned to camp. What Ray could reconstruct from witnesses and scraps told a harsher story. Fritz had been trembling for days. He had not slept. He had spoken of hunger, not of food, but of hunger for meaning. At 01:55, he had whispered to Eric, "We cannot breathe here." They tried to crawl out. They met metal and noise. Fritz died. The pattern emerged. In 6 weeks, the camp lost 5 men to escapes, 3 to suicide, and 2 to accidental deaths during flight. That was 11 deaths. In the records, each loss was tagged with a code. On the ground, Ray saw the same root: idleness, shame, and the absence of routine that kept men human. He made a count on a scrap of paper. 11 names, 11 ripples in the blankets. He drew a line under the names and wrote in block letters, "Something must change." The statistics were blunt. If nothing changed, the rate of serious incidents would climb. The camp could never become safe by adding more guards. More guards only enforced the same bleak, cyclical state. Ray knew something engineers know about failing machines. Sometimes you must change the environment, not just the parts. He began to talk to a few trusted men quietly. There was Benny Ruiz, a GI pianist from New York, who had been drafted into military police and assigned to the camp. Benny played gospel and swing for the mess lines. There was Corporal Joe Harris, an electrician who owed Ray a favor. They met after lights out. They whispered about a projector, about a crate, about a night screening. "Ray, you realize we could get busted," Joe said. "We could go to the stockade." "I know," Ray answered. "But I also know we'll lose more men." Benny tapped the keys on an imaginary piano. "Music calms people. It gets them to listen. Movies distract them. They'll sit and watch. That gives us time to breathe." They made a plan. Small steps, a night screening, a band on the back of a supply truck. If the command grumbled, they would dismantle. If the men were calmer, they would return and let the program grow. Ray's realization hardened. The camp regulations were not the enemy. Apathy and neglect were. He could take a risk. The risk was not abstract. It could cost him his career. It could cost others their liberty. But he also had a ledger of names in his head. Klaus, Johann, Fritz. He could not unsee them. He could not accept the ledger's quiet arithmetic. He chose to act. The final straw came on April 4th. Hayes, Private First Class Robert Hayes, came to Ray after roll call. Hayes was 26, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He was slated for transfer back to Europe, but was stuck in the camp as a secure escort. He had been on guard during the night Fritz was killed. His eyes were hollow. "Ray," Hayes said, voice low. "Is there anything you can do? Anything at all?" Hayes did not ask for wine. He did not ask for letters. He asked for something that would keep men from breaking. His desperation cut through the uniform like a sharp knife. Ray had seen that look too often, the human alarm that arrives when a friend is slipping. He knew Hayes would not beg unless he meant it. Ray thought of the Strand and of the way the projector's lamp made everything seem possible for a short hour. He thought of the memos and the legalese and the provost's frown. He thought of Klaus's scar and of Johann's boots. Ray made the choice in the length of a single breath. He decided to break the rules. He decided to build a theater without permission. He knew the sentence he could receive if discovered. He knew a court-martial could ruin him. He knew he might be confined. But Hayes asked, and Ray could not unhear that question. He recruited Benny and Joe. He scrounged a shipping crate labeled medical supplies and turned it into a projection booth. He borrowed a lamp from the motor pool and rewired it to a generator in the supply shed. He tuned Benny's piano and taught 2 prisoners basic chords under the tutelage of a Polish POW who could sight-read music. He wrote no memos. He filed no requests. He worked in the middle of the night, hands filthy, heart thudding. Each bolt he tightened felt like a small vote against the ledger of names he carried. He told himself he would stop if the command intervened. He told himself he was a soldier, but also a man. The choice now had a shape: a clandestine opening night, an hour of film, a band to finish, and the breathless watching of whether the prisoners would gather without suspicion. He felt fear. He felt responsibility. He felt the weight of absent men press on his shoulders. It was late. The supply shed smelled of oil and old wood. Tools lay across a tarp. The generator idled at a low throw-room outside. The sky was a black cloth sewn with far lights. Ray's hands shook. Sweat or oil left a dark smear on his forehead. He worked with a flashlight clenched between his teeth. Benny tuned the piano by ear. Joe swept the floor and hid extra blankets under the benches. The modification itself was small in concept, but exacting in execution. Joe fashioned a shutter out of spare aluminum. Benny spliced in an extra foot of cable and rewired the lamp to a safer switch. Ray drilled holes and fitted ventilation to keep fumes away. He wrapped the projector lamp in mesh to stop sparks. It took 8 minutes by his watch to install the final safety clamp. 8 minutes that felt like 8 years. If this fails, Hayes goes out tonight and may not return, Ray thought. He felt each rivet's decision like a heartbeat. He whispered a prayer he had not prayed since he was a kid. Lord, let them stay. When the booth closed, he steadied the spool. He threaded film through with gentle fingers. The first reel slid into place with a soft click. The film smelled of vinegar and ink. The generator purred. Benny struck a low chord on the piano, and the sound swallowed the shed. Dawn approached. The men carried the makeshift equipment to the parade ground. They placed chairs in neat rows. They cleared a patch of mud and set the screen made from a sewn blanket between 2 flagpoles. Word had spread quietly. Tonight, a screening. Tonight, music. Ray stood at the booth. He watched the sky change from black to indigo. He felt the risk like a weight in his coat. The morning watch rotated. Hayes strapped his sidearm tight. He did not know what would happen. Ray's hands did not stop trembling. At 07:42 a.m., the camp bell rang, a routine noise, but Ray heard it as the heartbeat of a moment. Tea. He checked the lamp. He looked at the crowd filtering in. He saw faces he knew and faces he did not. He closed the booth door and threaded the film. The decision was made. There was no return. The screen would light. Men would either sit, stunned, or angry. Men would either leave their plans to tunnel or to fight, or they would stay. He started the projector. Light spilled across the blanket. The first image flickered. The hush fell. The first chords of Benny's piano wove through the yard. He watched to see what would happen next. Note: this section covers the initial screening, the first jazz performance, prisoner reactions, and immediate changes. Present tense, short sentences in action, precise timestamps and sensory detail. At 07:42, Hayes walked out. He walked to his post. His boots sank into mud. He smelled coffee. He heard the projector. He felt his heart ratchet up. By 07:50, prisoners had gathered. Rows filled. An interpreter called out quietly, asking men to take seats. Even the Feldwebel stood with a cigarette and watched. The trumpet player adjusted his mute. Benny took a breath. The wind smelled of diesel and cooked potatoes. At 08:03, the screen lit. A chorus line appeared in black and white. The camera cut to a close-up on a smiling woman. The crowd leaned forward. The projector hummed. The image had a tiny flicker. A dog barked at the edge of the crowd. Someone clapped, uncertain. At 08:14, first contact. Not with the enemy in the field, but with the enemy inside men's heads. A young prisoner named Heinrich Dietz, age 20, started to sob. He covered his face with his hands. Beside him, an old man from the eastern provinces folded his hands and closed his eyes. A murmur rose then fell. Men watched. At 08:21, a small scrap of paper, an escaped attempt plan, fluttered from a pocket of a man in the second row. The paper slid to the ground. No one touched it. No one shouted. No one ran. The plan lay there like a ghost. The light on the screen kept moving. At 08:30, Benny and the makeshift quartet began to play between reels. Trumpet, piano, bass, and the hollow click of brushes on a drum rim. The sound was raw and alive. The music pushed into the quiet spaces between frames. It filled the air without needing to be loud. At 08:32, two guards at the perimeter shifted their weight. They looked at one another. They whispered. One lit a cigarette and let the smoke rise. In the booth, Ray felt the spool turn. He felt the light warm his palm. He watched the crowd breathe. The band hit a syncopated rhythm. A prisoner, who had not laughed in weeks, snorted unexpectedly. A grin managed to crack the line of his mouth. At 08:40, the first murmurs broke into a chorus. Men began to tap their feet. An older soldier who had been stoic for weeks, began to hum under his breath. The Feldwebel spat once, then exhaled a long, soft breath. He had not seen this in months, humans looking like people again. At 08:47, an interpreter walked the rows. He asked a few men what they thought. Responses were single words. Beautiful. Strange. Is it real? Some whispered that this had to be staged. How could the Americans provide such luxuries? Others argued softly that it was showing them a life they'd lost. At 08:55, a scrap of the escape plan had vanished. Whether someone pocketed it or whether the wind claimed it, nobody ever knew. It was a small thing, but small things stacked. They became a different tally. At 09:02, the screening stopped for a short intermission. Ray opened the booth. He felt raw. Benny's hands were steady. Joe's face was pale with relief. Hayes's jaw had unclenched. Men drifted to the water barrels. They spoke. A cluster of prisoners compared notes on the film's plot, awkward in English. A childlike curiosity returned to their posture. At 09:10, the band started again, this time with a swing number that made men grin openly. The trumpet threaded a melody that seemed to carry out over the goals and the fence and even beyond the sky. In that moment, the camp felt less like a prison, and more like a temporary town, held together for a few hours by a screen and some notes. There were no bullets. There was no aerial dogfight. The kill here was different. It was the killing of an idea. The idea that these men would always be breaking. At 09:18, a group of prisoners who had planned an organized brawl in the barracks earlier that week approached one another in the open. They talked instead. They argued over the plot. They pointed at frames on the screen. Two of them walked away and began to whistle the tune. At 09:25, a man named Wilhelm Kraft, 27, from Bremen, tattooed hand, stood up and offered applause. The others looked at him with surprise. Wilhelm was known for his temper. He was also known to have been involved in 2 previous scuffles. He clapped, quietly at first, then louder. Others followed. At 09:33, the piano solo made someone shout an English word, "Bravo!" in a clumsy way. The shout scattered like stepping stones and landed in a ripple of laughter. Laughter is an odd ordinance. It breaks the tense geometry of a place. It undoes the exactness of hate. At 09:40, a guard reported over the radio. "All quiet. No unusual movements." The tone in his voice was uncertain. He had expected trouble. He had not expected a film to hold men. At 09:45, the quartet performed a number that required call and response. Benny called. The prisoners answered, with clapping. A prisoner who had not moved in days tapped a heel. Another tapped both feet. The air filled with a new noise. It was not all joy. It was a brittle, worried sound. But it was motion. At 09:52, Hayes walked close to the fence. He watched the priests, owners listening. He thought of the men who had died trying to leap over wire or swim in rivers. He thought of Klaus and Johann and Fritz. He forced himself to breathe. At 10 o'clock, the screening ended. The screen collapsed into a heap. Men filed out slowly. For the first time in weeks, they left the yard in orderly rows and spoke in low voices. There were no fights that afternoon. There were no attempts to dig. There were conversations, small and human, about the music, about movies, about mothers and puns and smells, and the strangest thing, hope. Ray stepped out of the booth. He felt hands on his shoulder. Hayes nodded once. Benny wiped his palms on his trouser leg and smiled a smile that started in his eyes. "It worked," Hayes said simply. He sounded tired. He sounded relieved. Ray kept his hands on the frame of the door. He held the light in his eyes and let it warm him. That night in the barracks, guards found a note scrawled in German on a scrap. It read, "We were allowed to be humans for an hour." Someone had folded it and hidden it under a log. These were small things, fragments. They were not official. They were not yet policy. They were, however, changing what men did with their hands. The next day, the screening had ripple effects. Men who had not come before asked why they had missed it. Word spread by slow, human networks. A prisoner who had been near death from pneumonia sat up and smiled at the pianist. That alone felt like a small miracle. At 07:30 the following morning, an interpretive debate began in German about whether the Americans were trying to gas men with softness. Some insisted it was a trick. Some swore it was a genuine attempt to keep them from breaking. Arguments flared. No fists, only voices. Voices can be weapons too, but they were less deadly. At 08:14, the second public performance happened. Ray had added a small innovation, a short newsreel in German to run before the feature. A simple set of footage about Red Cross packages and letters reaching families. It was not propaganda. It was information. Prisoners watched footage of crates labeled with neutral logos and of men signing receipts. A younger prisoner wept at the sight of his mother speaking to a camera in faded film. He had not seen a face like that in months. At 08:35, an officer from the provost marshal's office came by, apparently because someone had filed a complaint. He watched the final 10 minutes with folded arms. He did not speak. At intermission, he asked Ray whether the program would continue. Ray lied. He said the screening was part of a morale survey for the guards. The officer scribbled something. He left. At 09:12, a third engagement took a sharper, more disciplined form. A prisoner debate club that had been held quietly for weeks asked D permission to perform German folk songs in exchange for a small stage time at the end of the screening. Ray agreed. They rehearsed with a lumber plank and a borrowed violin. The performance was raw and painfully beautiful. The prisoners sang about bread and lost homes. Some guards joined with muted curiosity. An interpreter wrote lines in a notebook and later sent them to the chaplain. At 10 o'clock that day, the reports from the perimeter desk recorded fewer incidents and calmer morale. The daily tally of attempted escapes went down to 0 for 10 days in a row following the initial screening. Discipline had not broken. It had folded into something else. A schedule. Men who had nothing to do now had something on Tuesday nights. Ray felt exhaustion and a kind of quiet victory. The theater had not solved war. It had not ended hostilities. It had not changed orders from higher command. But it changed what men did with their time. It stopped the slow attrition of despair. It gave the camp a small rhythm. When the first modified schedule printed in the daily log, no credit line named Ray. The log read, Pilot Recreation Program tested on a voluntary basis. No incidents reported. It was the kind of bureaucratic language that hid details, but it also hid a success. At 1800 that evening, Ray sat on a crate and let the sun dry his coat. Hayes sat beside him. Benny practiced scales softly. Joe turned over a loose bolt with his wrench. Men laughed in the distance. Ray watched the yard and counted the faces. He thought of the ledger again, and the names that had filled it. He could not undo the past. He could, however, try to stop the next line from being written. He wrote the first line of something else. A list of volunteers who would learn to run the projector and a rota for performance nights. He handed Benny a stub of pencil. Teach them, he said. Benny smiled and nodded. They were not heroes in uniform. They were working men. They made things run. The change was not thunderous. It was small, stubborn. It traveled slowly. But the first screening had passed its test. The light had cut the dark. Men stayed. Word moves in a camp like water, finding cracks and seeping in. The projection and the band caught on the same way. Other NCOs noticed. Corporal Andrews from the kitchen came by on Friday with a thermos and watched a Saturday night screening. He took it back to the mess and told the cooks. They were calm, he said. They did not try to fight. The cooks passed the word. Mechanics showed up next. A lieutenant from an adjacent work detail asked if the program might reduce thefts of tools. They came with practical questions and stayed for the music. By August 20th, a date that matters, because the rhythm had moved beyond rumor into habit, Ray had modified 9 registered recreation nights. The program had a clear pattern: film, music, a short newsreel, then a local performance. The rotation gave prisoners a schedule and gave the guards a predictable night. More mechanics, inspired by Joe, made their own safety clamps. More pianists volunteered. A private named Samir Haddad, formerly of the Merchant Marine, offered to drum. He was 25, from New York, the son of Lebanese immigrants, and he had served in London in an orchestral pit. He taught a prisoner the basic rhythm of 4 on the floor. The prisoner, Eric, learned quickly. The results multiplied. Theft reports dropped. Fights in the mess decreased by 30%. Attempted escapes flagged down to a handful per month. The camp log no longer looked like a list of lost souls. It looked like a schedule with a place for entertainment. Specific examples drove the change. Wilhelm Kraft, who had clapped on the first night, later intervened to calm an argument between 2 other prisoners, preventing a brawl that might have ended in severe injury. Benny's quartet, working with prisoners on drum rolls and simple harmonies, taught a prisoner cellist named Otto to accompany them. Otto later performed a solo that brought a guard to tears. The numbers were not grand military metrics. They were human measures. They counted fewer broken bones, fewer nights on guard duty chasing shadows, fewer funerals. In July, Camp Forest recorded 15 major incidents. In August, after the first 2 months of the program, incidents dropped to 5. By September, numbers suggested that the program correlated with a reduction of reported violent acts by close to 50%. No one published these figures. They were small, informal tallies, kept by men in spare moments. But they mattered. They turned a clandestine project into a functioning, useful practice. Word spread across adjacent camps by rumor. An MP who had been transferred told a friend at Fort Douglas about the movie nights at Forest. Men wrote letters home mentioning the projector and the band. Families looked at their sons' letters and felt a tremor of relief. Ray kept the program low profile. He avoided any press. He avoided any headline. He wanted it to work quietly. He feared official scrutiny. Yet the quiet success became a network. Men borrowed film reels from Red Cross packages. A chaplain in an adjacent camp sent a crate of sheet music. Mechanics shared clamps and wiring diagrams in whispers. By late autumn, 9 camps had adopted similar programs on an unofficial basis. Each program was different in details but similar in aim: to give prisoners a schedule, to keep them occupied, to restore a sense of human normalcy. The programs reduced the immediate risk of escape and violence. They bought hours and days and sometimes entire lives. The German prisoners reacted with suspicion at first. They were not used to being offered anything that wasn't rationed, controlled, or used for manipulation. They whispered that the Americans were staging scenes to show how humane they were. They called the theater a show and compared it to a stage production. Some even said it must be a trap. But then small things happened that dislodged suspicion. A prisoner named Hans Meyer met a nurse at the Red Cross tent after a performance and received a letter he thought lost. She had found it in a stack of parcels and brought it to him. He cried. He forgave the music a little. From the German viewpoint outside the fence, the program looked odd. Some local town papers and visiting officials noted the rather festive nature of the yards. Rumors reached a minority of German officers who called it softening tactics. In Berlin, some propagandists tried to spin it as American decadence. Inside the camp, such arguments grew thin under the simple fact of a man humming a tune he had not hummed since childhood. The official discovery came months later, and in an awkward way. An incoming supply inspector walked past the parade ground mid-screening and filed a note with his superiors. Unclear purpose for such gatherings. That memo moved through channels and landed on a colonel's desk. The colonel came to see for himself. He arrived on a rainy Tuesday, coat collar turned up, boots splashing mud. He watched a performance, listened to the rhythm, and displayed little emotion. After the screening, he called Ray into his office. "I understand you organized this," the colonel said. His voice was even. He had a file folder that looked ready to open. Ray expected the worst. Ray explained calmly, with the practical detail officers appreciated: reduced incidents, improved compliance, fewer escapes, and the raw metrics from the guard logs. He described the modifications to the projector and the safety protocol they had designed. The colonel read the numbers. He read the interpreter's notes. He asked about chain of custody for the film stock. Ray answered. He kept his shoulders square. He admitted to working without authorization, to improvising the booth, and to teaching prisoners to operate the projector under supervision. For a long moment the colonel said nothing. Then he spoke. "You broke regs," he said. "You also reduced incidents. I have to weigh both." His pen tapped on the folder. "I could court-martial you. I could also recommend we pilot this in a formal program. Your superiors are right to be wary, but I am not an idiot." The colonel walked out with a report that put the decision in 2 places. He recommended a formal trial period under supervised conditions. He did not recommend punishment. The decision balanced risk and reward, and, in an odd way, it validated Ray's gamble. Higher command mulled the paperwork. Engineers ran tests on the modified booth. The legal office scratched its head. The provost marshal wrote a memo that read in a cautious, bureaucratic tone, "Recommend supervised recreational program with safety review." The language was dull, but it permitted the program to continue. What happened next was not an official award or public recognition. It was a provisional acceptance and a grudging permission to expand. The colonel's memo had the word pilot stamped on it. That single word allowed the program to exist without Ray being court-martialed. But the acceptance came with conditions: regular inspections, records to be kept, and limits to the number of gatherings. Ray agreed. He signed the forms and then sold a cigarette to his OA guard because he had none left in his pocket. He did not want medals. He wanted men to stop dying. The program continued, now under the weak sunlight of authorized status. It lost some of its covert romance, but gained the ability to scale. That mattered. It meant more nights, more bands, more projectors, and, most importantly, more human hours where men could be less dangerous to themselves and others. Engineers arrived to run tests. They checked ventilation, lamp housings, and cable insulation. They put meters on the generator. They took notes. The technical evaluation read simply, "The modification is safe if installed to specification. Ventilation required. Wiring must be standardized." The legal office reviewed incident logs. They ran the numbers on escapes and injuries. The final summary read, "Pilot recreational program correlated with a marked decrease in incidents related to escape attempts and interpersonal violence." No credit line for Staff Sergeant Collins, an evaluation memo said dryly. It noted instead that the pilot program initiated locally may be rolled out under supervision. This was bureaucratic language for, "We will extract the idea and leave the man out of the story." Quietly, the program spread. The War Department authorized a supervised recreational pilot for POW facilities. New projectors arrived in crates. Chaplains coordinated a schedule. Bands were allowed to use simple instruments. Personnel manuals were updated with a single new paragraph. Recreational programs may be authorized to reduce security incidents, subject to safety approval. Ray's work was present in the new memos, but absent in any praise. The program, now written into policy, resembled any number of institutional reforms. It bore functional language, dry steps, and no single hero. The practical result mattered more than the paperwork. Camps that had adopted similar programs reported fewer runaways and calmer nights. A colonel at Fort Douglas wrote to Camp Forest asking for the program's plans. Ray shipped detailed diagrams and a list of suppliers for stage blankets and spare lamps. The men who had once risked court-martial found themselves giving hands-on training to other camps. There was no medal. There was no press release. There were, however, fewer funerals. There were fewer silent roll calls where faces had been lost. Hayes survived the war. He flew back to Iowa in 1946. He returned to a life of carpentry and Sunday church. He told Ray later that he thought about those nights every time a customer came in asking for a fix. "It taught me to listen," he said. Ray stayed in the Army until 1947. He returned to Dayton and rebuilt his life. He went back to the Strand for a season and then opened a small projection and repair shop. People called him the Projection Man and sometimes asked, jokingly, whether he had saved the world with a lamp. He always answered with a short laugh and a hand to the face. Benny moved to New York after his discharge. He played in clubs and sent money home to his sister. He never forgot the quartet in the supply shed. He once, in a newspaper interview decades later, mentioned that he and a few men had helped a fence sound like a stage. He said the line without boast, as if the matter were ordinary. How many lives were saved? Ray made a rough count in his head over the years. He added the official incident reduction numbers and his personal recollections. He estimated between 80 and 100 American guards and prisoners avoided serious injury or death as a consequence of the program's calming effect across multiple camps. The number is not precise. It is practical and human. It matters because each life had a name. The men who had died remained on his mind. Klaus, Johann, Fritz. Ray wrote their names on a scrap of paper and kept it in his pocket for years. He never forgot them. He could not bring them back. He could only attempt to stop more names from appearing. Strategically, the program had a subtle effect. Fewer escape attempts meant fewer resources diverted to searches. It reduced small confrontations that might have escalated into larger incidents. It allowed camps to maintain order with fewer punitive measures. In several documented cases, the presence of recreational programs made the difference between a long siege of mutual hostility and a tolerable, managed custody period. In 1952, an Army manual on prisoner handling cited the use of supervised recreation as a recommended practice. It did not mention Ray by name. It did not need to. The seed he and a handful of men had planted had taken root. Many of the men who had been prisoners later immigrated to the United States. Some wrote letters to the camp after the war, thanking the men who had shown them a screen, a trumpet, and a piano, when their world had been in pieces. One letter came from Johann's sister in Mannheim, thanking Ray and the men for giving Johann a last night of feeling human before he left. It arrived with tears in the envelope. Ray kept the letters. He kept the paper with the names of those who had died. He kept the memory of a spool turning in a dark booth. Those relics were his medals. Ray's later life was ordinary in the best way. He married, fixed radios, ran his projection shop. He taught local kids how to thread film. When people asked about the war, he would say he was just a mechanic. He said it plainly and let the description stand. Occasionally, a historian knocked on his door. They were younger men with notebooks who had read an obscure memo or a chaplain's diary. One researcher, in the 1980s, tracked down Ray and asked the obvious question. Did you really do that? The projector, the band, the theater? Ray sipped coffee and told the story, plain as a tool list. He told them the names he kept. He told them about the nights he could not sleep, tipos. He, historian, put dates in an article, and the article spread. Relatives of prisoners wrote letters. A small memorial in the local paper told the outline and gave Ray a brief nod. He read it, folded it, and set it on the table. That is how his story was rediscovered. Piecemeal, patient, by people who listened to scraps of paper and assembled them. The historical record confirmed the impact in broad strokes. Supervised recreation reduces incidents, increases safety, and preserves human life. The archives show memos and numbers, but they do not contain the warmth of a trumpet at dusk. The principle of this story is simple. Innovation in war does not always march out of engineering rooms or high command. It sometimes grows out of small, unauthorized acts by men who know the immediate problem and refuse to watch the ledger fill. It comes from sergeants and mechanics who see faces instead of forms, who trade strictness for human practice when strictness becomes cruelty. The final image is a photograph taken decades later at a reunion. Ray stands by a projector, old hands folded. Behind him, a group of men, some former prisoners, now older and gentler, sit under a tent and listen to Benny play a tune. They are smiling. Each face is a life that persisted. If you found this story compelling, please like the video. Subscribe for more stories that uncover the hidden human work of war. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. These are small acts of attention, and they keep memory alive. Thank you for keeping these stories alive. I could not, and will not, mimic a specific living creator's voice exactly. The script above is an original work that follows your structural and stylistic directives as closely as possible. Timestamps, named people for deaths, short punchy action sentences in combat tense scenes, exact times, sensory detail, and the required call to action at the end. If you want this adapted to be longer to exactly hit 7,000, 8,000 words, I can expand each section with additional named vignettes, technical appendices, safety diagrams, sample memos, or more combat incident detail. But I will do so in original language and without copying any single channel's phrasing. Tell me which sections you want expanded: characters, deaths, camp spread, post-war epilogues, and I'll extend the script accordingly.